Welcome to Decoded Health, the podcast where we unpack how progress in technology is reshaping the future of healthcare. From machine learning models that read medical images to algorithm that predicts disease before symptoms appear, technology is no longer just supporting medicine, it's actively redefining how care is delivered. But with this progress comes a critical question. Can we really trust the system that we're building? And today's episode dives into one of the most important frontiers in modern AI, model reasoning. As models grow more powerful, accuracy alone is no longer enough. Clinicians, regulators, and patients all need to understand why a model makes a decision, not just what it predicts. And to explore this, I'm super excited to be joined by Niklas, whose work sits at the intersection of machine learning, reasoning, and real-world deployment. Niklas Muennighoff is an AI researcher at Stanford. He was born in Munich, Germany, and got his bachelor's degree at Peking University of China. He has led the development of multiple open-source large language models and benchmarks. And at the age of 25, he has already been cited 20,000 times and won multiple Best Research Awards in renowned AI conferences like iClear and ACL. That's a mouthful of introduction from my end. So, Niklas, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience today?
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
So I'm a PhD student here at Stanford studying computer science, focusing on AI.
Yeah.
Large language models specifically. And I got here originally from studying business, and then I had an inflection point at some point where I realized I should instead focus on AI. And I realized in order to do AI, I got to learn coding, and then I went down the rabbit hole and switched paths and eventually ended up here doing AI research.
I see. Yeah, I remember so clearly the first time we met is during the interview weekend for a scholarship. And I remember asking you this question. I was like, why do you want to do AI? Because you did business administration at Peking U, right? Is there a particular event or a story or some part of your experience that informed you of that decision to delve into AI?
Yeah. I think there was one experience that was pretty formative in that regard, among others as well. But I did an internship at a healthcare consulting company called LEK in Japan, Tokyo. And I thought, okay, I want to do healthcare. I want to do something to improve health in humans. And I thought I could tackle this from more of a business angle. So go in consulting and help pharmaceutical companies fight disease. And while there and working on a schizophrenia-related drug, I realized how complex the current pharmaceutical process is. So we were helping them in bringing the drug to market, but they had done years of R&D and clinical trials for this single drug that doesn't even cure schizophrenia, but just alleviates some of the symptoms. And so this is a multi-year pipeline for a drug that doesn't move us that much forward. Definitely important. And then I felt that this process, it'll be very hard to scale all the way to curing all diseases that humans face in a near-term future. And I was thinking for a while, okay, what would be an approach that could get us there? And it seemed to me, at least, that the bottleneck is intelligence. So if we had more human researchers working on figuring out these diseases, then we could move faster. But having a lot more human researchers is pretty hard. You need to have kids. It takes a lot of time. So it seemed like AI is the path to accelerate our health research and get us to curing diseases and solving health issues much faster. So I decided to pivot.
Yeah, I remember that so clearly because I remember talking to you and you said the biggest dream of yours is like to cure all diseases in the world, and you chose to use AGI or artificial general intelligence to achieve that goal. But in order to achieve that, it's like very complex, right? Because like these days people are talking about model performance. People are criticizing models these days for not having the reasoning capability. And having building a model that can reason very well is like kind of your area of expertise. So can you tell us a little bit more about what are you currently working on?
Sure. And just a quick comment on that. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. You're tackling it more from a medicine background. You're doing your MD and tackling sort of the actual diseases, and I'm going sort of the other route where AI will hopefully do it, and I don't understand that much about medicine as you do. And so currently I'm working on reasoning and specifically trying to get models to think for longer and achieve better results that way. Because questions I care about are things like, okay, how do we cure cancer? What's a likely drug that could solve this and this issue? And I imagine that this could require a lot of reasoning, a lot of thought on the on the model side, and we don't necessarily need an answer very fast, but it could take its time and then come back and hopefully give us a good candidate. So this part of reasoning, especially long horizon reasoning, has been my focus.
That is a very interesting point, and I actually recently read your paper S1, which is test time scaling, and in your paper you talk about how if you train the model to think longer, then they will think better. And then you have some techniques to have like budget enforcing where like you don't want the model to think indefinitely. There's like a certain point that you want to cut it off. So how do you determine this threshold of like how long you want the model to think and how long do you want it to stop thinking because like computing constraints?
Yeah, I think the North Star is probably that the model itself knows how hard the task is, how long do I need to think to solve it with X% confidence, and then the user can maybe tune up or down the confidence and the model will say, okay, this is how long I need in that case. And the state of where we are and what we did in that paper is we still decide ahead of time as the user how long the model gets. And then in our paper, we just cut it off at that point in time, and then it'll provide the best answer it's got right now. I think the field has made some progress where you often can do it without directly cutting off the model, but letting it know, okay, this is how long you're going to have, and sort of the model can adjust its thinking based on that rather than being suddenly cut off.
Interesting. And I know that like, defining reward and value functions has always been very challenging. I was curious about, what do you think is the future of reinforcement learning? And how do we better engineer the reward function or value function to better mirror how humans think about reward and risk?
Yeah. I think the way I think about reinforcement learning, and this might be flawed, but I think at a high level, there's two ways to learn. One is by imitation, and one is by trying things yourself. Right. So either I directly do whatever I'm told or just read a book and then implement it exactly as written in there, or I go out and try things myself and sort of learn from feedback from the environment. And the second one is obviously more akin to reinforcement learning, and the first one is in the LM world, at least pre-training and supervised fine-tuning, often used in post-training. And from that standpoint, what is the future in RL? I think that the model needs to be able to try a lot more things. So right now we're pretty constrained in terms of the environments where we are doing RL, versus ideally you'd want to be able to try it in all kinds of environments. But right now it's often math or code and not necessarily, say, run an experiment in the laboratory and get feedback. And that would be pretty exciting because it seems a bit closer to curing diseases in the longer term. And that's one part where I could see the field moving toward more environments. And there are some other aspects that we could go into.
It's a very interesting point you're raising, because I remember watching the Elias recent interview, right? And he was saying that like these days the benchmark are designed in a way that it mirrors like a test. Even in medical world, they're testing on how model performs on MCAT, which is like the entrance examination for going to medical school. But those tests doesn't really mirror a real world application, right? Like it doesn't really test the model's performance when they're actually assessing a patient and arrive differential diagnosis. What do you think is the bottleneck here? Like why can't machine learn to reason as well as us? Why can't they just have this ability to generalize as well as humans do?
Why they cannot generalize as well as humans?
Yeah. Like, for example, you can train a human with, like, pretty small sample size, right? Like, for example, when I go to driver's ed, like, my coach probably, like, wrote me, like, 5 or 6 sessions. And then later on, I was able to kind of, like, navigate different environment, different conditions in the road. Obviously, there will be edge cases, too, right? Like, there will be accident conditions, like, very bad weather. But I think human learns to navigate through those very challenging scenarios with very limited training. Whereas for a machine, you need to really train 1,000, even million sample in order for it to be very good and competent at one task. But they're still very bad at like those scenarios where like there are edge cases where like things that they haven't seen before. So I'm curious your thought.
Yeah, I may be wrong on this, but I would challenge that the view that LLMs or AI doesn't generalize as well, because I think it does generalize quite a bit to many tasks where, say, it's not completely different from what it has seen. And humans as well, we've seen a lot of data that we're using to generalize. So in this driving scenario that you mentioned, we have a lot of other things that we learned that help us get there faster. Mm-hmm. If you put a baby in that scenario, right, say you're training an LM or a model from scratch to drive, and it's got those 20 hours. If you do that with a human baby, it probably also won't be able to drive. But if you do it with you, a grown-up, then, yeah, you'll be able to drive after just a couple hours.
Yeah.
And that's somewhat similar to, I think, how we're doing it with AI, right? If you just train it only on driving data, then you might need a lot more because it doesn't have any priors that it can use to generalize faster. And so I would think that if we're able to give these models similar priors to what we have, then they might generalize just as well, if not even better.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that because I feel like our understanding of brain, how we perceive things are so limited that maybe we're doing a lot more things. Our vision is so great. Like, it's just like when you see something, you're able to identify the object, right? Whereas for computer vision, you have to train, like maybe first you have to identify objects through like image segmentation, and then you need to do classification, right? Like you are trained on so many different data points in order to achieve a very simple task. So maybe I feel like our nervous system and our brain is doing a lot more compute than we think they do. And it was very funny that you mentioned this kind of replay, right? I think for humans, we learn things through our memory, right? Like memory consolidation is a key aspect of how we do things. I'm curious, like, have people tried to design memory for reasoning models?
I'm pretty sure they have. I would say there are two kinds of memory, roughly, or maybe three that you can have in current models that people are playing with. Mm-hmm. One is in context, so you keep things in context and that acts as memory, which already naturally happens during generation. The second is you write it off to some text-based memory database. And the third would be some update to the parameters of the model, and some memory is stored there, right? So either in the parameters in the previous context or in some external database or files that the model writes. And I think people have explored all three, but we're yet to have a standard approach here. I think in ChatGPT you already have a memory feature where it does memorize things about you and then reuses them in future conversations. Mm-hmm. And I would speculate that this uses mostly in context learning, where when it saves those memories, it always places them in the context when you start a new conversation with ChatGPT. And there's some potentially an additional model that triggers whenever it wants to save a memory and get stored, and then just add it to context in the future.
Interesting you brought up the idea of like maybe continuously learning through updating the weights of the model. But I feel like these days, right, but correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like every single time when you're trying to, update the belief of prior beliefs of a model, you have to retrain them from scratch, right? You have to recollect all the information again, train like ChatGPT 6, right? Like for a model to do better and learn new information that's, coming out after the previous generation of model was being trained on. So why is that a technical challenge to continuously update the model on the new data that's been generated after model training?
I think the main challenge with that approach is that you need to balance forgetting and learning new things. So as soon as you start updating the entire model, then you risk deleting old knowledge that might still be useful. And it's hard to control where exactly this new information gets put and how the old information gets removed. So I think that is the main bottleneck, why it's easier to just, okay, let's just start from scratch. In addition to, often people want to change some parameters about the pre-training, say they want to make the model a little bit bigger, then it's often easier to start from scratch anyways, rather than taking an existing model and just trying to add in new knowledge, remove outdated knowledge.
Interesting. These days, one of the concerns that a lot of people have in the field is that you are running out of data to train. Every model has basically scraped all the website and internet. There's like not a lot of data to train anymore. Do you think like the age of scaling is kind of over and now is like the age of like thinking and, you know, doing reinforcement learning?
I would view thinking and RL as another scaling paradigm rather than replacing scaling. So we've moved in a way in multiple scaling paradigms, starting with pre-training, where it was the internet data that helped us scale up, and then a little bit of post-training, where it was a lot of human data to teach models to follow instructions and adhere to human preferences. And now we're kind of in the third inning where it's thinking, and we're scaling the models by letting them think longer during RL and then also after training to solve user problems at inference. And I think there's a fair amount of additional scaling to be done there. Mm-hmm. And after that, if we find another scaling paradigm, or if we're back to the age of research, as Ilya said, I'm not sure.
It's very interesting, yeah. I remember when we first talk about machine learning, you're very excited about like different application. But these days, I feel like once we examine the model's performance in real world setting, right, it doesn't really scale up to the hype. I'm like curious about your thought on like what's the next stage of machine learning in general. Do you think Transformer had the capability of achieving a lot of different tasks, or do you think that Transformer has its inherent limitation and we need better architecture to handle more complex tasks? For example, a lot of people have been saying about developing world models, where LLM is just one of the modality, but you also need like computer vision, image modalities to supplement large language models in order to achieve a lot of tasks. What do you think?
Whether the Transformer will be enough?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Transformer is one fundamental limitation that we probably have to get around, but other than that, I don't see a major problem. And the one thing that I do think we have to get around is its quadratic complexity in sequence length. Essentially that the longer it thinks, for example, the more expensive it gets for each new bit of thinking it does. So the longer the text it processes, the more expensive. Mm-hmm. Versus, I think at least for humans, it's constant. Right? Every new thought doesn't cost me more than a previous thought, I would say. But it's roughly the same. And it doesn't scale if it increases, right? Because eventually it's so expensive that you cannot do anything anymore. And so that's one thing that I think we'll have to fix, but it can work by largely keeping the same architecture. It doesn't necessarily need a new architecture. There's some other ways that people are working on to fix that. But other architectures are exciting too. It could be a small efficiency gain that makes us achieve things we have faster, but I'm not sure that it's on the critical path, so to say.
Interesting. Because these days, a lot of people are saying that, like, there's like a huge AI bubble, right? And I think a lot of this sentiment stems from the fact that a lot of AI companies, AI startups especially, are essentially using the same architecture, which is Transformer, right? Because like everything is Transformer based, and a lot of them are being called like ChatGPT wrapper. Do you think that AI bubble exists? What are your thoughts on the future of AI and commercialization and industry application?
I would look at this from a maybe supply-demand angle,
okay.
Where I think there is a lot of demand for AI, so it is providing a lot of value in the world, at least in my life, and I think also in many other lives. And so I think you have a bubble when the supply is way, way larger than the demand, right? And then eventually, like those two forces, they always have to be somewhat in balance. If one is really out of balance, then eventually it snaps back, right? If there's way too much supply, then things are going to crash at some point. Like prices might crash to meet the actual demand that's there, and companies will go out of business. Whereas the other way around, if there's way too much demand and little supply, then a lot of people will be working on racking up that supply, which then might lead to oversupply again and back and forth. And currently, I think there's a decent amount of demand. Is the supply getting a lot higher? Maybe it's a little bit higher, the data centers that the companies are building. Maybe there's a little bit of sort of overinvestment, but I don't think it's to the extent that is completely unrealistic. So maybe it'll snap back a little bit, but I think demand is very high, and especially I think demand will keep increasing as these models get better and can provide more value. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the long-term future of AI.
Yeah, I think I will personally agree with what you're saying. I do think that like maybe AI, from my perspective, will kind of mirror the progress of internet, right? When the so-called .com bubble in the early 2000s, where there are a lot of internet startups being built, and then like they all went like bankrupt after a couple of years. But then like, you know, there are a company like Google and Yahoo kind of persisted and became such a big part of our lives, right? And transform how we think about things and how we do different things. So I do think that like AI might very possibly mirror a very similar path. Another question I have for you is more from a social standpoint, right? Like I know a lot of people have fear about being replaced by AI, especially in the medical field. I think a lot of people are saying that, oh, radiologists might be the first group of doctor that will be suffer from this like AI boom, which I don't personally agree, and I can tell you the reason why I disagree later. But I'm like curious your thoughts on kind of the workforce future and when AI is really becoming more and more powerful. What do you think AI is going to bring to the workplace? Do you think people are going to be laid off because AI are going to take their job? Like another argument that people use, right, is like when internet first came, a lot of people or a computer, people are thinking that like a lot of jobs would be replaced. But then like it turns out those technology creates more jobs, like software engineer, right, coders. But another argument or counter argument to that is that actually this is the first time where we have a technology that actually mirror human thoughts and human thinking. So it could completely replace human because they're so similar to the way that we behave and act. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it helps to think about this in the short, medium, and long term. Mm-hmm. And my guesses on each of those would be that in the short term, largely right now, it is extremely useful to augment our jobs. And most jobs stay as is, and they get a lot more productive thanks to AI. Mm-hmm. Then in the medium term, we might see some jobs move away and some other jobs become more important. I think this probably also happened with the internet and previous technologies where maybe at some point you didn't need as many people to, say, write things for you, write letters or things like this, but rather people just did it via email or things like that. And so I think some jobs will naturally sort of move away and some other jobs will come into existence. I think with AI, one example is probably, depending on how fast self-driving cars progress from here, I can see a future where we don't have as many Uber drivers anymore at some point, and rather it's done by self-driving cars. Mm-hmm. And then that could be the medium term, and new jobs would emerge, which is obviously those people who build the self-driving cars and people who write really good prompts potentially and things like that, which are already in existence. And then in the long term, which obviously also has a lot more variance associated with it, it's a lot harder to predict, I think. You could argue that maybe it gets to a level where it is better than all humans at all economically valuable tasks, and that's why there might not be jobs in the traditional sense. And that could be, I'm not sure. But either way, I wouldn't worry too much. I think if you do something that is fun to you, then ideally it doesn't matter too much if you get paid for it. And if a machine can do it better, you might not. But we still got to figure out some way that people obviously can live and pay for their expenses. But I would just think about doing something that you love and not worrying too much about being automated. And then, yeah, definitely considering rescaling and adjusting to the changing field if you're, say, taxi driver or things like this. But
yeah, I would agree to a certain extent. Like, I remember there's a very one famous radiologist was saying that, like, AI is not going to replace radiologists, but AI is going to replace those who do not use AI. So I do think that in the near term, I think AI is going to increase or improve the efficiency at workplace, and it can definitely make human plus AI combination stronger than just human or AI alone. I think that's the reason why previously I said I don't foresee a near future where like radiologists or like doctors or medical professionals are being replaced by AI, because I think that humanistic interaction is such an essential part of medical care. You're seeing a doctor not just because he's going to offer you the best treatment, but also like for the emotional aspect, right? This person is going to reassure you and kind of, walk you through this very challenging process, help you internalize some of the fears you have and anxiety you have with your medical condition. So I do think that humanistic aspect of healthcare is very hard to be replaced. And another thing is like more practical reason why AI is not going to replace doctors anytime soon is like our legislative infrastructure not there yet, right? Like let's say if we integrate a chest X-ray AI to diagnose lung conditions, right? And if it were to fail, it has a misdiagnosis. Who's there to be at stake? Who's accountable for that? Is that the people who are developing AI? Is that the doctor who are using the AI? Or like, the hospital who are paying for the service? And I don't think we have a very clear legal infrastructure for us to determine those accountability, for us to actually trust AI's integration into clinical workflow. So yeah, that's kind of my take on the future of AI within the healthcare domain. And another like very, I guess, hyped up word these days, which got me very excited about, right? It's virtual cell. The premise of virtual cell is you're able to model a very complex cellular environment using machine learning and to predict the cell state after some sort of perturbation. And by perturbation, I mean you can inject cell with a certain drug, right? Or you can CRISPR out some of the genes, make it upregulated, downregulated, and see the result of that cell state. But I think training a model like that is extremely hard. It requires a lot of clean data, and model doesn't have the capability to reason through their prediction. And then I think one of the ideas I have right now is like trying to inject some biological prior to the model so they can understand the basic principle of biology when they're making those reasoning. But then like a lot of people would disagree with my approach, saying that if you kind of constrain your model with some sort of biological prior, then model lost its ability to uncover the latent representation and the features that are not readily obvious to human, which is what they're really good at, right? So what are your thoughts in kind of injecting this prior knowledge in model reasoning? Do you think it's a common practice in the industry right now, or do you think it's a flawed practice that you don't think there's a lot of merits to it?
Merits with respect to injecting latent knowledge into the reasoning of models.
Exactly, yeah.
I think there has been progress on models that reason with images. I think OpenAI also had a thing on this where they showed that the model is better if it can, I think, even manipulate images during its reasoning and play with them. So it absorbs the latent knowledge and then also uses it, in this case, image data. So for medicine, I haven't come across work exploring this, but I do think it's exciting. But I would question whether we really need it to be, say, cell features, or we can just turn it into regular text and image data, maybe some other senses that we also perceive as humans, because it makes it a little bit easier to understand it as a human as well, if it's using the same senses that we do, versus if you try to featureize the cell, maybe it gets a bit harder to explain, and it departs from the work on reasoning with images and text. So those would be my thoughts, but I think it's pretty important to use reasoning for all of these domains. I think it should lead to gains, and especially for healthcare, I think it'd be very exciting.
Yeah, and I think there's a group at Yale actually collaborated with Google to develop something, as you said, like they treat gene expression as tokens, and then they develop this model that's essentially a large language model that processes those tokens, but within a gene context, and they're able to achieve pretty promising results. I think the biggest reserve a lot of people have with the field of virtual cell is the data that's being trained on, right? Like I think a lot of people are saying that these days we're focusing on single cell RNA sequencing data, which is not a really good representation of how different cells within our body interact. There needs to be cleaner, less noisy data in our data sets to be able to, and also like not just single cell sequencing modality, but also like, let's say 3D transcriptomics, or data that capture a broader sense of how different cells within, let's say, a tumor microenvironment interact with each other. And I know a lot of companies like Tahoe Therapeutic that are actively building data sets that are for that purpose. What do you think about the future of virtual cells, where kind of the AGI for healthcare? Because I know that like these days, Meta just announced that they're going all in for building next generation biological foundational model. And you personally, right, you want to cure all diseases using AI. So what do you think is the future of biological foundation models?
Yeah, I think that's very exciting that people are looking into this. I think it is good that we're approaching it from two different sides, where one side, and that's the one that I find myself more on, is just trying to build very general intelligent models that then, among other domains, can be applied to healthcare and solve problems there. The other side being that you directly specialize and build systems like AlphaFold and virtual cell systems that sort of from bottom up try to solve healthcare step by step. And maybe at some point they converge and the general model starts to use some of the specialized models as tools, but is the orchestrator of the overall goal, which might be curing some disease. And we've made a lot of progress, and I think it's very exciting to keep pushing from both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I totally agree. And let's shift gears a little bit, right? We talk a lot about technical problems that we're facing in both healthcare and AI. Let's talk about you specifically, right? Like I think, to understand a great researcher really needs to understand their story and their experiences. Obviously, like you are very accomplished at your age. You have like age index over 47, I think, at this point, which is impressive as a second-year PhD student. One of the things I'm like been thinking about lately, the term research taste, and it resonated with me because I do think great researchers have a very good taste. Tell us a little bit more about your research taste. How do you define your research taste? How did you acquire that research taste?
So I would define it as working on problems that are really important to you, and if you care about it, also to broader society. So it doesn't have to be, I think, work that is really impactful, as long as it is what you want to do. But for me personally, at least, one of my criteria is that I'd like it to have impact on broader society, because I wanted to, in the long term, make a small contribution to getting us to curing diseases. So that's one of the criteria for me. And then I think once you're clear about what you want to do, what is your goal in research, then I would argue that you think about, okay, what is the most important problem to get us there? What is the most important issue that stands in the way? And then read some of the current literature on that problem. How far have we gotten to solving it? And then picking up from there and trying to solve it. So I think that's a relatively simple, say, 3-step process where you start by figuring out, okay, what is it that you want to solve, then read the current approaches to solving the problem, and then pick up from there and try to push us a little bit further as far as you can and keep going. I think there are other great thoughts on this. I enjoyed a blog post from John Schulman on research taste that he wrote, where he divided it into two different approaches. But overall, for me, what has worked pretty well is this 3-step approach, which I think is kind of first principle based. You just think about, okay, what is the actual problem we got to solve? What have we done so far? What can I do to push us further into that direction?
That's super informative. Because I remember, like, when we were talking about problems in the past, your approach, like, for example, when I asked you, like, what, like, your paper, right, like the details of your paper, you always say that, like, you try to write paper that are very self-explanatory. You want your information to be able to convey to the general public, not just people in the field. You try to avoid using very technical jargons or, like, very complex formula. Do you think that pursuit of simplicity also heavily informed your research taste?
Yes, I think so. Personally, I come from a non-CS background largely, and when I started reading papers in the field without knowing a lot of the details yet, it sometimes felt really hard to understand. Mm-hmm. And I would like the research that I mainly focus on to be very accessible so that it can be useful to medical researchers potentially, that can then help us to progress on curing diseases. And also the ideas themselves, I think, should be very simple, because if not, then it makes it very difficult to adopt. And in a sense, I think there are multiple costs to simplicity. So it's not just that it's easier to adopt, but it's also simple methods are easier to communicate. They're ideally also easier to develop because there's less code involved. And there's a bunch of other, I think, trickle-down effects where it has a lot of advantages to focus on very simple things rather than more complex approaches.
Yeah, I definitely think that a lot of great scientists within the AI research field will share a very similar sentiment, where they think that, like, the best way to approach a complex problem is, like, to model very simple things and then figure out how, like, as you mentioned earlier, it's like a bottom-up approach, right? Like, if I know how to model a simple thing, then how can I advance to the next level? And I'm, like, very curious about, like, you mentioned that you're not really a strictly CS background, and yet you're able to master the language of coding, and then you really have published a lot of very influential projects. So my question for you is, like, in this AI age, do you think people still have the need to learn programming language? Do you think, like, going to school studying CS, learning the syntax is still valuable? Or do you think, everyone can just basically teach themselves using AI? You don't really need to, know the difference between, like, Java or Python. Like, you kind of just have a general idea of what you're trying to do, and then have AI kind of code it for you.
Personally, I strongly prefer the approach of learning by doing rather than imitation, which references back to our earlier discussion on this in models, because when I'm doing something, then I will learn whatever is needed on the way to get there. Mm-hmm. Versus imitation, I might absorb a lot of things, some of which might not be very useful to some later action I intend to do. So if I would, and this is similar to how I got into the field, I first set myself a goal of doing something, and then I learned whatever was necessary to get there. Specifically, when I started, I found this competition called the Hateful Memes competition from Meta AI at the time. And I thought, okay, I don't know how to code yet. I don't know much about AI at all, but let me try to compete in this competition and submit some solution. And then I started, okay, in order to do this, I first got to learn Python, because I now need to actually write some code that submits something. And I gradually built myself up from there, went to Python and then Bash and other terminal-related stuff, and then eventually a little bit into AI and PyTorch and so on. And at the end of this, it was fortunately a relatively long competition, a couple of months. I was able to submit a winning solution among the winning solutions to the competition, and that was very gratifying because I'd actually done something. I don't get that much gratification out of just completing courses, but I think actually putting things out there that are useful to people is much better.
And let's get back to the topic of research taste. I think about these terms a lot these days, right? I think that by examining a lot of different people, I think their research taste is also heavily influenced by their personality and personal value. And I remember like during our retreat for the scholarship program, we were asked to map out our top values. And I remember you have a very, very unique and interesting set of values that are very similar to mine, actually. Can you talk a little bit more about your values, your top 5 values, and how do you think those values shape your way of thinking and research domain?
Sure. Maybe let me start with a big influence that has shaped my values, which has been the work of Maslow, the Maslow pyramid, for example, the extended version. I think it's a pretty useful concept to refer back to figure out what is important to you in life.
You're right.
And based on this, my number one value is health, because I think if you're not healthy, then none of the other values matter, because you might be dead and then nothing matters potentially. Maybe there's an afterlife, in which case maybe it's fine, but I haven't seen concrete scientific proof of that. So I think health is number one, and it's the bottom layer in the Maslow pyramid. And then after that, the Maslow pyramid continues with safety and so on. And I think these are all pretty important. And some of the other values that I care a lot about are somewhat related, such as integrity and love and so on.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think like health is so important to humans, right? Like without health, you can't really pursue any other passion that you have in life. How do you think, you mentioned love, you mentioned integrity, curiosity, those kind of stuff. How do you think like, your path to AI was shaped by those values?
I think one value that has probably shaped it a lot more, that we also talked about earlier, is simplicity. Mm-hmm. That I'd like to keep things simple. Ideally, don't have too many distractions as well. So it's not just about the research direction, but also about personal life, where if there's too many things going on, at least I find it very hard to do one of them really well. And so keeping my life simple to some degree has also helped me in focusing on what I want to do. And the other values are very important with respect to collaboration, I think, integrity, love, and so on. And collaborating is really critical to achieve something in this field. It's interesting because often I think in academia it's tempting to work alone, and certainly I've worked alone a lot in the past, but A, you can achieve a lot more if you work together, and B, it's so much more fun. So I'm trying a lot more to work with other people whenever possible.
So how do you forge those bonds of collaboration? Like, what are your approach to approach somebody and be like, hey, let's collaborate? I feel like that's always a challenge for me, right? Like, when I'm trying to collaborate with someone, I always struggle to, like, make my idea appealing to them and have them on board, right? Like, how do you sell your vision to people that you never met before?
I think there's two parts. One is I come from my long-term vision and gradually break it down to the current project. And the second one is looking at their long-term vision and trying to connect it to the project. So at the end of the day, we're both individuals and we have something in our mind probably where we're heading toward. And you just got to connect these distant dots to this current thing that hopefully advances both of you in a meaningful way toward your goals. And I think it is a lot about trying to draw this connection. And that's quite possible with many AI projects, I feel. It's a pretty general area of research that can be applied to many fields.
I absolutely agree. I think medicine especially, right, and also AI too, is a field that it's a teamwork, essentially. Like, you are never alone. You're always in a team setting. I think collaboration is really the key. Like, you can't always take the lead. You also sometimes need to understand the role of being a supporting player, and like let other people with more expertise to shine in that particular task. So if you were to give a piece of advice for young researchers, what would your advice be?
I think there's a lot of things to say, and I'm not sure I'll have the best advice, but another thing that's maybe besides what we've talked about thus far is to heavily focus on quality over quantity. I haven't always been the best at this, but at the end of the day, quality matters so much more in research, I think. It's much better to have one really impactful work than 10 medium to low impact